Our lecture for this week covers moral objectivism versus moral relativism. In addition to watching this lecture, make sure you also read the Poyman article on D2L, and then make sure you also watch any additional videos that are posted to get more of a context than what I'm able to offer here. So in our last lecture, we talked about metaphysics, and we talked about the distinction between our perceptions of reality and reality in itself. And in this distinction, we describe the process of learning as being a process of getting my subjective perceptions to match an objective reality. This notion is a fairly common sense approach to learning, and we can easily understand how it applies to things like trees. A tree is a physical object, and so if we want to learn about trees, what we're doing is we're trying to get our perception of a tree to match the way that a tree actually is. So now when it comes to the question of whether moral principles are objective or relative, what we are trying to do is discover whether or not the process of learning applies to ethics. In other words, we all know that we have moral feelings. So when we witness, say, a tragic event like the Rwanda genocide in the early 1990s, this was an event where a group of people known as the Hutus, who were part of the majority people group in Rwanda, decided to arm themselves with machetes, clubs, blunt objects, and other weapons to systematically rape, maim, and kill their Tutsi neighbors. This was a genocide that lasted for about 100 days, and somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed during that time period. Now, when we witness an event like the Rwanda genocide, we will likely have emotions that cause us to think that such tragedies are not mere tragedies, but they're also deeply immoral. We might even use words like wicked or deplorable to describe them. These are the feelings of moral judgment. And the question we need to ask is this: are those feelings connected to anything that is real, outside of our mere perceptions? If you answer yes to this question, then you would be a moral objectivist. If you answer no to this question, then you would be a moral relativist. And one of the reasons why moral relativism has philosophical appeal is because there are difficulties in defining what is meant by a moral fact. So we all know what physical facts are, but what exactly is a moral fact? This question is much harder to define, and so maybe it would be helpful for us to begin with an analogy using the concept of health. In one of the assigned videos for this week, you will hear philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris explain that the concept of morality is much like the concept of health. Like morality, health is also a difficult concept to define, and yet the concept is not unintelligible. We can see this by asking the question of which drink is more healthy, orange juice or apple juice. Well, there might be significant debate on this question, and perhaps this is a question that we will never be able to answer. But note, this does not mean that therefore the concept of health is incomprehensible. Consider a similar question. Which is healthier to drink, apple juice or Drano? Now, Drano is a drain cleaning product that you pour in your sink to get rid of clogs. Well, the answer to this question is not that difficult. We know that drinking Drano will kill you, whereas drinking apple juice will not. Recognizing this distinction highlights that even though the concept of health is difficult to define in a precise manner, it is nonetheless an intelligible concept that allows us to determine the difference between healthy foods and poisons. The concept of morality is similar to this. So now if I was to ask you the question, which acts are more moral? Building a house for Habitat for Humanity or serving at a food kitchen? Well, this question might not have an answer, but again, it does not mean that the concept of morality is unintelligible. To see this, we only need to point out the extremes on the moral continuum. For example, if I was to ask you which is more ethical, participating in the Rwanda genocide or building a house for Habitat for Humanity? The answer to this question should be obvious, and in the lecture by Sam Harris, he uses this moral continuum, as he calls it, to demonstrate why moral values are not vague or relative concepts. Well, this may seem simple enough, but we should ask, why would some then argue that moral values are relative? Well, to answer this question, we need to make some important distinctions to understand what is meant by ethical relativism. And the first distinction that we need to make is that of cultural relativism, or what Poyman calls in his article, the diversity thesis. This thesis highlights that different cultures do have different moral values. So on your screen we have culture A versus culture B, and so you can imagine a culture A, where it is a moral duty to benefit an elderly person by taking her life when she gets older. Now that certainly represents values that we would not in our culture agree with, but then we could also imagine culture B, where it is morally forbidden to take the life of an elderly person. So here you have two cultures that have two distinct views, very different views, contrary views, on what is considered morally valuable and morally good. Or we consider a culture where it's morally permissible to promote racism and segregation. We can certainly think of cultures that have promoted this in the past, and we can think of cultures that promote these types of ideals today. Versus another culture, culture B, where racism is morally wrong, no matter the motivation or the cause. We could think of many examples where different cultures have very different moral values. And so this diversity thesis, the fact that different cultures do have different moral values, then leads to another thesis, which we call the dependency thesis. This thesis states that morality is the set of common rules, habits, and customs that have won social approval over time so that they seem part of the nature of things as facts. There is nothing mysterious or transcendent about these codes or behaviors. Rather, they are the outcomes of our social history. So now when you combine the diversity thesis with the dependency thesis, many will argue that this provides a foundation for ethical relativism. And so to understand this argument, I would refer you to the Poyman article posted on D2L. And in that article, Poyman explains, if different cultures have different moral values, which would be cultural relativism, and if those moral values are binding only for people who live in that particular culture, then it follows that there are no universal moral principles that are valid for all cultures and all people at all times. We will briefly evaluate this argument in a moment, but before we do, let's turn to another claim mentioned by Poyman, and that is the claim of subjective ethical relativism. This position states that morality is in the eye of each individual beholder. So now we're not talking about cultures, broadly speaking. We're talking about how each individual is able to come up with his or her own system of moral values. So no one person or no group of people can judge another person's moral values or moral views. This would be subjective ethical relativism. And in short, it states that just as different societies have different moral values, the same thing applies to different individuals. So Poyman argues that if this perspective were correct, then some absurd consequences would follow, such as Adolf Hitler would be just as moral as Gandhi, or judging another person is just as moral as not judging another person. Or we might say that promoting racism would be just as moral as fighting against racism. So because of these contradictory positions that one could hold, Poyman concludes that radical individualistic relativism seems incoherent. He argues, therefore, that the only plausible form of ethical relativism would be one that grounds morality in a group or a culture. And this form of relativism is called conventionalism. So now, as we're looking at conventionalism, we might ask, what makes this view attractive? Well, one of the things that makes it attractive is that it seems to undermine intolerance, and it seems to undermine ethnocentrism. So we know that it feels wrong, at least from our culture, it feels wrong to judge another culture's moral practices by comparing those practices to the moral sensibilities of our own culture. Something inherently feels wrong to us about that. And we might ask the question, well, who says our culture is right? Because couldn't it be the case that another person's culture, that they might judge us on our moral practices by comparing them to the moral sensibilities of their culture? So if they can do it to us and we do it to them, who says that our culture is right? There is something that I think is inherently attractive about this position, especially given the moral sensibilities of those who are raised in cultures where tolerance, acceptance were taught as foundational moral values. But Poyman points out that this is actually where the problem with this position arises. He writes, "The view contains a contradiction. If no moral principles are universally valid, how can tolerance be universally valid? Whence comes its validity? If morality is simply relative to each culture, and if the culture does not promote a principle of intolerance, then its members have no obligation to be tolerant. From a relativistic point of view, there is no more reason to be tolerant than to be intolerant, and neither stance is objectively morally better than the other." And so Poyman goes on to say, if conventional relativism is accepted, then racism, genocide of unpopular minorities, oppression of the poor, slavery, and even the advocacy of war for its own sake are equally moral as their opposites. And this seems to be unacceptable from Poyman's perspective because it promotes a contradiction when it comes to moral values. But Poyman also points out a logical flaw in conventional relativism by arguing that it makes an unwarranted slide. He says the argument for conventional relativism starts with this premise: we observe that different cultures have different moral rules. And so this is something that we can all agree upon. Poyman doesn't doubt it. We all observe that different cultures have different moral rules. But then we move to this conclusion that doesn't follow logically. We conclude on the first premise that no culture's set of rules are better than any other culture's set of rules. And this just does not logically follow. And to see that it doesn't logically follow, we might note the distinction between description versus prescription. So description is where you describe something, such as we describe the phenomena that different cultures have different moral values. We can describe that, we know that it's a fact. But then we move from description to prescription and say, therefore, different cultures ought to have different moral values. To see the fallacy in this type of reasoning, consider a different example. In a math class, we might observe that different students provide different answers to the same math equation. Well, this doesn't mean, therefore, that different students ought to provide different answers to the same math equation. To make that type of argument is to confuse the distinction between description versus prescription. And so the unwarranted slide that Poyman is talking about is that ethical diversity does not imply ethical relativism. They are two distinct things, and we must not confuse them, because it might be the case that some moral systems are simply wrong. Just like some students simply get wrong answers on a math equation, so it might be the case that different cultures and different individuals get different moral principles wrong, whereas other cultures get them right. And so now this moves us into talking about ethical objectivism. So you need to note that for this class, the material that we're going to be covering assumes some sort of degree of ethical objectivism. Now note, this does not entail ethical absolutism. The absolutist believes that there are non-overridable moral principles that ought to never be violated. Well, this absolutist position seems difficult to defend because one can always find a situation where moral principles don't seem to apply. So we might take lying, for example. Well, in general, not lying seems like a good moral principle, but it doesn't take much work to think of scenarios where lying would be morally permissible. And so moral objectivism doesn't claim that you have to have moral values that apply in every possible situation. Rather, what moral objectivism argues for is that there are valid rules of action that should generally be adhered to. Not always, but generally. But that may also be overridden by another moral principle in cases of moral conflict. And so this is the general position that our class is built upon, and that is the position that allows us to look at different ethical principles throughout the semester. So we're going to examine some of the more plausible ethical principles that have been proposed by philosophers and ethicists throughout Western philosophy. And through this study, we will find that between these different principles, whether we're talking about the utilitarian principle or the libertarian principle or the egalitarian principle, we will find that occasionally there are tensions between these principles. But these tensions, I want to argue, do not undermine the notion of objective moral values. Rather, these tensions provide opportunities for us to continually refine and fine-tune our moral principles so that those principles would more accurately correspond to reality.